Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today's deep dive is, well, it's an exploration of the ultimate human mystery, the concept of God and the tensions of atheism. We will explore how ancient humans basically built the divine in their own image, why modern atheistic critiques often miss the historical point of these sacred myths, and how the philosophy of religion attempts to bridge the vast gap between scientific facts and spiritual values.
Yeah, it is a massive undertaking to try and decipher the origins of human belief.
Seriously.
But the source material we have today gives us some incredibly sharp tools to do just that. We are pulling from two very distinct, very dense texts.
Yeah.
The first features excerpts from Birent Esinolu, who takes this hardcore historical and sociological approach to the mysteries of religion. He's looking at the actual mechanics of society.
And to balance that out, we have Mustafa Shekip Tunç.
Exactly. Tunç's philosophical writings lay out a roadmap for a true philosophy of religion in a modern scientific world.
I've been poring over these notes all week, and the way these two thinkers approach the topic is just, it's fascinating. But before we get lost in the weeds of ancient history, I want to take a second to remind you, the listener, about our ground rules for this deep dive.
Always a good idea with this kind of topic.
Yeah, because we are talking about highly debated, deeply personal concepts today. The origins of sacred texts, belief, modern atheism. Our goal is absolutely not to take any personal sides or, tell you what is true or false.
Right, we're just analyzing.
Exactly. We are just putting on our analytical hats and looking at these concepts strictly through the historical and philosophical lenses provided by our sources. And hey, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
That is the perfect mindset to have here. When we strip away the emotional charge of these debates...
The baggage, really.
Yeah, the baggage. We can actually see the fascinating evolution of human thought. Knowledge becomes incredibly valuable when you can step back, look at the architecture of an idea, and understand why it was built that way in the first place.
So let's look at that architecture. Esinolu's work starts with a premise that immediately flips the traditional narrative upside down.
It really does.
He brings up an idea, which is rooted in the theories of Marx and Engels, that historically humans have actively created concepts of God based on their own societal designs. But then, over generations, humanity basically forgets it was the architect.
And ends up bowing down in fear before its own creation.
Right. It is a profound psychological flip.
And Esinolu uses a brilliant metaphor to frame this entire investigation. He points to an ancient inscription found on a statue of the Egyptian goddess Isis, located in the ancient city of Sais.
What does the inscription say?
It says, "I am all that has been, is, and will be, and no mortal has yet lifted my veil."
Wow.
Yeah. For thousands of years, religion has operated behind that veil of unquestionable dogma. So Esinolu's project is an attempt to finally lift it, to peek behind the curtain and see the raw, earthly, socioeconomic gears that were turning when these divine concepts were first engineered.
So what happens when we peek behind that curtain? Because looking at the timeline provided in the text, it seems like the concept of God is, well, it's anything but static.
It morphs constantly.
Take ancient polytheism, for example. The Greek gods on Mount Olympus weren't exactly peaceful, transcendent beings.
Not at all.
They were petty. They threw tantrums, waged wars, held grudges, cheated on each other. I mean, it sounds more like an ancient soap opera than a divine realm.
That soap opera aspect is exactly the point. Those early polytheistic gods were not abstract, perfect concepts because the societies that created them were not unified or peaceful.
Oh, I see.
The heavens acted as a direct mirror to the political realities on the ground.
Right.
When you have a human society deeply fractured into competing, warring city-states.
Each with its own king and army.
Right, its own interests. It makes total sense that their conceptualization of the universe is also fractured into competing, warring deities. The gods were just exaggerated versions of local warlords.
That makes a lot of sense. So as human society scales up, the gods have to scale up too.
Precisely. As those chaotic city-states were eventually conquered and absorbed into massive centralized empires ruled by a single absolute emperor, the spiritual mirror reflected that change. Religion underwent a parallel shift toward monotheism.
Because a single empire demands a single deity.
Exactly, a single supreme deity. Monotheism appeared much simpler and more absolute. But by projecting this singular perfect power into the sky, it effectively masked its own messy sociological origins.
Let's back up even further, though, because there's a detail in the sources that completely caught me off guard.
The earliest depictions.
Yeah. Long before we get to the warring city-states or the massive empires, the text points out that the earliest global depictions of the divine were almost universally female. How does that fit into this idea of humans projecting their society into the heavens?
It fits perfectly when you consider the social structures of prehistoric humanity. Before the rise of sprawling patriarchal civilizations, early human societies were largely communal and matriarchal.
Right, hunter-gatherer times.
In a harsh, ancient world where mere survival was a daily struggle, the biological reality of women giving birth, literally bringing new life into the world, it was viewed as the ultimate magic.
The ultimate power.
It was the absolute height of power. So naturally, the earliest human attempts to conceptualize the divine took the form of a mother goddess.
But obviously that didn't last. The major world religions today are heavily patriarchal, so what drove that shift?
Economics and property.
Really?
Yeah. As humanity developed agriculture, the concept of land ownership took hold. We see the rise of inheritance, wealth accumulation, and the need to defend that wealth with physical force.
The power shifted.
Power shifted toward patriarchal structures. And just like the transition from city-states to empires, the heavens were rewritten to reflect the new earthly management. The supreme mother goddess was gradually replaced by the supreme father figure.
It is wild to think about these sacred concepts as direct reflections of ancient property laws.
It's a completely different lens.
And Esinolu goes even further, specifically looking at the texts of the Bible and the Quran. He points out that the famous creation myths we all know, like stories about God separating the chaotic waters, dividing the heavens from the earth, or molding the first humans out of clay.
They aren't original.
Right, they are not original to those texts. He draws a direct line from these stories back to much older, ancient Sumerian myths.
The Sumerian connection is vital for understanding this unbroken chain of human ideology. When sociologists and historians look at texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the various Sumerian creation myths, they are essentially looking at the foundational blueprints for the Abrahamic religions.
So it's not just a coincidence.
No, the parallels are not just loose similarities. They are highly specific narrative structures that were passed down and adapted over thousands of years.
The sources mention a specific Sumerian concept where the gods supposedly created humans simply to do their heavy lifting and labor. Esinolu argues this is actually a massive projection.
Yes, it is the ultimate reversed image. The ancient texts claim the gods created man to toil in the fields so the gods could rest.
But sociologically speaking,
Sociologically speaking, it was the human ruling class creating the concept of gods to justify and organize the labor of the lower classes.
wow.
It was a way to say, you aren't farming this land because I forced you to. You are farming it because the divine order demands it. It was the earliest form of ideological crowd control.
If we accept that these texts are deeply human, sociological artifacts designed to manage ancient societies, it creates a massive modern dilemma.
The clash between atheism and history.
Exactly. This brings us to a major conflict highlighted in our sources, the clash between modern atheism and historical reality. Esinolu uses a specific case study here, Turan Dursun, a very prominent Turkish critic of Islam.
Turan Dursun is a perfect avatar for the modern skeptical movement. His approach is to take these ancient sacred texts and subject them to strict, unforgiving 21st century logic.
Looking for literal contradictions.
Right.
The prime example given in the text is Dursun's critique of the story of Abraham. According to the tradition, Abraham has a dream where God commands him to sacrifice his own son.
A very famous, very difficult story.
And Dursun asks some incredibly harsh but completely illogical questions. He asks, how could a simple dream ever be considered legitimate proof of a divine command? And more importantly, why would a supposed loving, merciful God grant a man a child, only to demand that the father murder the child as a test?
Right.
From a modern standpoint, it sounds like psychological torture.
To a modern mind, it is entirely horrific. But this is where Esinolu's analysis takes a fascinating turn. He argues that while Dursun's logic is sound by today's standards, this specific type of atheistic critique is actually incredibly superficial.
Superficial? How is calling out human sacrifice superficial?
Because it completely misses the profound historical reality of the text. Dursun is judging a narrative born from an ideology that is thousands of years old using the moral frameworks of today.
Okay, I'm following.
To understand the story of Abraham, sociologists argue you have to mentally transport yourself back to an era known as lower barbarism. We are not talking about the philosophical streets of ancient Athens. We are talking about incredibly fragile, terrified, early agrarian communities.
People who had no understanding of meteorology or disease.
Exactly. They were entirely at the mercy of unpredictable, violent nature. One bad drought, one harsh winter meant the entire tribe starved to death.
So they were living in a constant state of existential panic.
Absolute panic. And in that context of sheer terror and absolute scarcity, human sacrifice was not just a random act of sadistic cruelty. It was a desperate, dark, socioeconomic strategy.
A strategy for survival.
Yes. It was a society trying to survive by offering its most valuable, most precious possessions, its own children, in a desperate bid to appease the terrifying forces of nature.
Okay, that paints a really grim picture of human history.
Yeah.
But if human sacrifice was a common, desperate socioeconomic practice, how does that reframe the Abraham story? I mean, Durson is still saying God demanded a murder.
Here is the sociological key to unlocking that myth. The climax of the Abraham story is not the demand for the sacrifice, it is the intervention.
The ram.
Yes. God supposedly stops Abraham at the last second and provides an animal, a ram, to be sacrificed instead. Historically, this narrative marks a monumental, world-changing shift in human civilization. It coincides with the widespread domestication of animals and the rise of agricultural abundance.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following this. Are you saying the story isn't about a bizarre divine test of loyalty at all?
That is precisely what the sociological lens reveals. Society had finally reached a technological point where they had herds of sheep and surplus crops. They no longer needed to sacrifice their own children to manage scarcity.
Wow.
The myth of Abraham is an ideological monument. It is the exact moment in human history where our ancestors codified a new law. We don't have to kill our own children anymore. We have livestock now.
That is a staggering way to look at it. It turns a story about blind obedience into a celebration of human progress.
A massive leap forward in human rights and economics, wrapped in a sacred narrative to give it absolute authority.
But that highlights the massive communication breakdown we see today, doesn't it? You have strict religious believers on one side insisting the story is a literal, factual event of God testing a man. Then you have modern atheists on the other side attacking the literal logic of a 10,000-year-old story.
And both sides are locked in a stalemate because they are both trapped by literalism. When you argue exclusively over whether a man actually heard a voice from the sky telling him to grab a knife, you obscure the magnificent, turbulent history of human cultural evolution that the text is actually trying to preserve.
If treating ancient myths as literal science or literal history just leads to endless shouting matches, where does that leave us today? Does Mustafa Shekib Tunes offer a way out of this trap?
He does, and it requires a complete paradigm shift in how we define religion. Tunis is writing for an era of advanced science, and we even need a philosophy of religion when we have telescopes and microscopes.
Good question.
His answer lies in separating their fundamental functions. Science is strictly the pursuit of the how.
The physical mechanics.
Yes. Science explains the facts, the causes, the measurable laws of gravity, biology, and chemistry. It is objective. Religion, however, and the philosophy that surrounds it, operates in a completely different dimension. It addresses the why.
The meaning.
Exactly. It deals with the realm of values, meaning, purpose, and the concept of the absolute.
So the friction happens when we mix up the how with the why.
Almost all modern crises of faith and the rise of hardline dismissive atheism occur when spiritual metaphors are mistaken for physical science. Think about how ancient humans conceptualized God. Because they were constrained by their limited understanding of the physical world, they naturally placed their gods within physical space.
Right, like we said earlier. They believed gods literally lived on top of Mount Olympus or physically sat on a throne somewhere up above the clouds.
Exactly.
It's like they thought if you just hiked high enough, you'd literally stumble into Zeus's living room.
Pretty much.
But then humanity invents the telescope. We map the solar system, we launch satellites, and we realize the sky is just an endless vacuum. Nobody's up there.
And that technological realization triggers a dual crisis. Literalists face a devastating crisis of faith because their physical map of the divine has been disproven by science. Meanwhile, skeptics look at the empty sky, point to the satellite data, and declare that the entire concept of religion has been completely debunked.
They both miss the point.
Tuns argues that both of these reactions are fundamentally flawed. They are both treating religion as if it were simply a failed branch of astrophysics.
So how does a true philosophy of religion fix this? How do you save the concept of the divine from being dismantled by a telescope?
By elevating it entirely out of the physical realm. According to Tunce, we must push the concept of God beyond physical space and time. God can no longer be conceptualized as an old man sitting on a cloud that a rocket ship might accidentally crash into.
Right.
Instead, the divine must be understood as the ultimate realm of values.
The realm of values. What does that actually mean in a practical sense?
It means conceptualizing God as the absolute ideal of truth, beauty, absolute justice, and moral perfection. Science is an incredibly powerful tool, but it is equipped only to measure visible physical phenomena.
You can't put meaning in a test tube.
Exactly. You cannot put infinite meaning under a microscope. You cannot measure absolute justice with a thermometer. Therefore, when the divine is properly understood as this philosophical absolute, science simply isn't equipped to dismantle it, nor does it need to.
Because they aren't competing for the same territory anymore.
Exactly. They operate in parallel dimensions of human experience. Science provides the mechanical map of our reality, the brilliant, intricate details of how the universe functions. Philosophy and religion provide the framework for asking why that universe matters and what our moral obligations are within it.
That feels incredibly liberating. It means you don't have to choose between acknowledging the reality of the Big Bang and seeking a deeper spiritual meaning to your life. You can appreciate the mechanics of evolution while still wrestling with the profound question of human purpose.
It bridges the gap perfectly.
Let's pull all of this together, because we have covered a staggering amount of ground today. We started by looking at the deep sociological roots of belief, seeing how ancient humanity built the concept of the divine from the ground up to reflect their own struggles.
From the matriarchal mother goddesses
To the patriarchal sky gods of centralized empires, exactly.
And through that sociological lens, we examine how viewing ancient texts purely, literally blinds us to their true historical value. The story of Abraham isn't a horrifying tale of a cruel divine test. It is the preserved cultural memory of humanity finally leaving the desperate brutality of human sacrifice behind.
It is a record of our socioeconomic evolution.
Exactly.
And finally, we explored how Mustafa Shekib Tunç resolves the modern tension between belief and atheism. By separating the how of science from the why of philosophical religion, we can elevate the concept of God from a physical being hiding behind the clouds to an absolute ideal of values, something science can't touch and doesn't need to.
This separation is incredibly relevant for anyone trying to navigate today's intellectual landscape. We live in an age of intense information overload, where public discourse is often reduced to polarized shouting matches.
For sure.
You have strict religious dogmatism on one side and dismissive literalist atheism on the other. Looking deeper into the historical and philosophical context allows us to step out of that shallow debate. We can appreciate the incredible richness of human culture and our relentless, beautiful search for meaning without getting trapped in arguments over ancient literalism.
It really does give you permission to step back and just marvel at the sheer creativity and resilience of the human mind. We've spent this entire deep dive looking backwards, seeing how our understanding of God has constantly evolved to perfectly match our changing socioeconomic realities. From terrified hunter-gatherers praying to nature spirits, to ancient empires projecting absolute monarchs into the sky, all the way to modern thinkers conceptualizing philosophical absolutes beyond space and time.
It's quite the journey.
Which leaves me with a final, somewhat wild thought for you to mull over after we wrap up here.
Oh, let's hear it.
If the human concept of the divine has always adapted to mirror our current reality, what will it look like 1,000 years from now? When we are a multiplanetary species, perhaps living our daily lives intertwined with artificial superintelligence, what new image of the divine will we build to reflect that reality?
That is definitely something to think about.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll catch you on the next one.